everyone, and welcome back. I am so excited to get to share my project with you today. I have finally managed to make a pair of 15th century shoes. Now, I have been doing historical shoemaking for a number of years at this point in time, but I have really only focused on the 18th and 19th centuries. I haven't gone this far back before, so there were definitely a lot of gaps in my knowledge, but fortunately for me, a great deal of shoemaking technique does track backwards fairly far, so a lot of it's very universal. In addition to that, I did do a lot of research into, say, the 14th and 15th centuries in terms of shoes and shoemaking. I ended up using this book quite a lot. It talks about shoes that were found in excavation sites in London, so it's very useful in terms of tracking dates on things and understanding the patterns as they were sketching out the leather bits that were left, because rarely do you find an entire shoe from this era. Most things are in pieces and parts. So any information is really useful because we can see how the seams were put together or how the soles were done, what the general sole shape was. Even the tiniest bits of leather can tell us a lot about the shape and the construction of the shoes. There are, like I said, a few originals that survive, and there certainly are shoes and imagery, though it's very often more the toe rather than the entire foot. So there's a lot of extrapolation that has to go into figuring out exactly what shoe was used by what type of person in what era. But fortunately for me, between the research I could find online, the book, the images, and my knowledge of shoemaking, I was able to sort of cobble together a knowledge of shoemaking in that era and get a pair of shoes out of it. I am immensely pleased with these shoes because they are so cute. I'm probably just going to wear these for modern summer wear, I fully admit that. I'm definitely going to make more pairs of this style because there's so much more that I want to understand. There were things that I wasn't completely pleased with this pair and I'd like to try in the next. So there's definitely a lot of learning to do. But I definitely discovered so much during this process, and I really want to share with you some of the discoveries that I made that track across the centuries when it comes to shoemaking, because who knew that it was so universal for so long? The first place to start with any pair of shoes is the wooden last. Now, the last is what essentially will give the shoe its final shape. In this case, fashionable 15th century shoes tend to have a very long and pointed toe, though they are completely flat with no heels. I do have lasts that are somewhat similar to this, that are reproductions of early 19th century lasts. However, they have a rounded or a slightly square toe, so I needed to build that up. Now, it's not typical for you to have to build up lasts for a lot of shape in different eras, simply because they would have the last made to whatever the fashionable shape is. It is, however, common to build up your last to make it fit correctly, so the process of building up parts with leather is fairly familiar to me, and it is something that I had to do to the toe a few different times already. So I started off by layering up scraps of leather at the toe to gradually not only build it out, but to get rid of some of the curve up at the end of the toe spring, since this was made for a much shorter type of toe. All of these layers are just temporarily pasted together. It'll be very easy to pop this off the last at a later point, so I'm not ruining the last by doing this, but it is a much faster process than me carving an entirely new last from scratch. One of the key things that I will need to do here is actually do this twice over, unfortunately. In the 15th century, they are still using right and left lasts, meaning that they aren't the straight lasts of the 18th and early 19th centuries. So I'm going to have to do this to two different lasts. Thankfully, I have a pair already of the same style and the same size, so I just have to build them up to make them into being right and left, which is a good thing simply because the lasts are well fitted to my feet when I'm wearing very thin silk stockings, not so much when I am wearing bulkier wool hose. So adding a little bit to the sides of this last will also allow me to up the overall size of it. I tend to liken this entire process to that of working with clay. You end up rasping and roughing up all of the layers to make sure that they adhere to each other well. You build up in chunks and then carve it back down again. And the whole process in general really does remind me of sculpting. In the end, one of the key things is to make sure that it ends up not only well-shaped and symmetrical to its partner, but that it ends up being nice and smooth as well. So after making sure that all of the pieces have adhered to each other and are stable, I'll go back and shave down and rasp all of the different parts of the leather to make sure that it is as smooth as possible before I actually cover it all up with a very thin piece of leather. This will make sure that I don't end up with any major lumps or bumps in the shoes when I make them, and also if I ever decide to make a pair of shoes that isn't out of a tanned leather, wrapping it in a white leather will help prevent any staining when the leather is wet. Now, there were plenty of examples of original shoes that I was able to use as a reference point for the shape that this last needed to be. Most of them are fairly deformed, however, when it comes to the uppers, so there is limited information. However, there's only a limited amount of difference in shape that you could get in order for it to still fit on a foot. So as long as I had the sole shape, that gave me reference for how the rest of the last needed to be shaped. I could see from originals and from the patterns and from a few somewhat detailed artworks that the toe was somewhat snub-nosed, even though it was very pointed, sort of bumped flat at the end, and overall the top line was very gentle and angled rather than being scooped out or turned up at the toe or have any other unusual bumps in it like, say, 1850s boots do. Once the last was complete, we move on to the patterning process. There's so many ways to do this. One of the best modern methods is to cover your entire thing in masking tape and draw the shape on that, but that's really best suited for something really complex or unusual, lots of straps, things that are more typical in modern or vintage shoes. For this particular style, most of what I could find, it tended to be in two major pieces. So you have the vamp area that wraps over the toes, you have two side seams, and you have a back piece that just simply is almost a square and wraps around the back of the heel. Sometimes there is an ankle strap that attaches to that back piece, or it may be sort of grown on from the front piece, angling upwards. So there were very few options on overall shape with this particular style, and I chose to go with what seemed to be the simplest and easiest to recreate, as I'm still not quite familiar enough with the proportions, and since I've never had a chance to actually see any of these shoes in person, examine them, take measurements, and figure out what the proportions need to be, I'm sort of eyeballing it and going off of the few extents and images that I can find. So I'm hoping that this will end up fitting my foot correctly and it won't awkwardly hit my ankle points or be too low on the foot and look proportionally incorrect, or be too high on the foot and I can't get it on. So I'm basing this off of some of the other shoes that I've made from other time periods as to what the proportions need to be, and we'll hopefully end up with something that looks correct in the end, and maybe eventually I can experiment with some other proportions as well. I did also choose to do some decoration on this particular pair of shoes. I could have gone with a completely plain style, and I think I will eventually make one, but I really liked all of the cutouts that seem to be very popular in the late 14th and through the 15th century. They're just really beautiful lace work, and I wanted to try out that style. So now that we have our uppers ready to be put together, we have the last ready to do all the shaping, we're going to move on to the actual construction. And unlike regular sewing, the very first step you need to do in shoemaking is dealing with making your own threads. we're not going to be using a needle and a single thread for this process. In fact, we're going to be making up threads that are made of multiple threads depending on the weight of the leather and the area of the shoe. You'll need different quantities. I'm going with a 5-strand thread for this particular area, but you can go with a single, 3, 5, 7. It just needs to be an uneven number. And you essentially wax and twist those to finish them off. The wax will help with protecting the thread not only in the stitching process from friction, but will also help the thread grip to itself and sort of create a protective layer against water or other damage. And as the shoe wears down, if the stitches become exposed, they will still cling to each other and you won't have your whole shoe come apart just because you wore down in one area. Shoemaker's wax, in this case, is made up of a combination of tar and pitch and resin and beeswax, and the exact compilation depends on the type of temperature that you're around. There's winter wax versus summer wax, or I have lighter colored waxes that are better for silk shoes where dark wax like this could stain them and damage them, and I sometimes use just straight beeswax on certain areas as well. But the best part is, it all smells slightly like a campfire, so I get a very nostalgic feeling from working on shoes. And as I said, I don't use a typical needle. I actually use a boar bristle. Now, there are some more modern items such as fishing line, but I find it very difficult to use that sort of thing. The benefit of a boar bristle is that it splits down at the end. It's sort of the texture of a very heavy cat whisker, and with the splits down at the end, you can actually just split hairs, as it were, and you'll end up braiding and twisting the tapered end of the thread into that boar bristle, and you make sure that way that it is smooth and tapered and won't be bulky as you're trying to get through the holes that you create with your awl. things I found really interesting about the examples of shoes that we have is that they very often had this little seam midway on the sole. I'm not entirely positive why. It might be a way to save on some leather, but when I cut it out, I couldn't necessarily see how it really saved much leather in comparison to, say, how I would normally cut them out as a single piece. But I went ahead and tried this out just to see if there is something that I don't fully understand about it, or maybe it is just a way to save on sole leather. I also want to note at this point that I am using slightly more modern tools than they would have used in the 15th century. This is not to say that they are incredibly modern. All of my tools tend to be based in the 18th century. They are all either reproductions of 18th century tools or they are antiques themselves. So rather than going out and getting a whole new set of tools to work with the 15th century, I am using some things that are slightly out of date. One of the more notable things is the fact that yes, I am using a curved awl blade rather than a straight awl blade. I do have some straight awls, but none that were the right size, and I'm so much more comfortable with using my curved ones. That is what I am used to, and I don't want to go through the entire process of relearning how to move my hands and end up breaking a lot of awl blades in the process. So yes, I am cheating just a little bit in that regard, but the general process of how the shoes are assembled seems to be the same. They're done as turn shoes, meaning that you actually make the shoes inside out. So the sole leather is what I'm working on now, and that is tacked onto the last inside out, and then you'll actually wrap the upper over that and stitch it directly to the upper. The whole thing will then get pulled off of the last and flipped right side out in the end. One of the downsides to this is that your sole leather can't be incredibly heavy. It has to be lightweight enough that you can actually turn it right side out. It's also going to be a little bit difficult with this particular style since it is a fairly pointed toe. There definitely were some that were far more pointed, and from what I could see, they tend to actually stop when they get near the toe, turn it right side out, and then finish that area in a different manner. I couldn't quite piece together how best to do that stitching, so I avoided going that long with my toes until I can better understand how that sort of assembly was done. Once the outsole is prepared and the upper is lasted over it, that's when you finally get to do all of the stitching. Now, one of the key things of making a pair of shoes is using the shoemaker stitch, meaning that you're actually working with two ends of your thread at the same time and weaving back and forth. They both go through the hole that the awl created and essentially knot around each other, and then you pull it tight. So it creates a very sturdy and long-lasting stitch that you don't have to worry about it coming undone easily, even when you wear down into the stitches. once we're done with stitching the shoe together, I trim back the rest of the seam allowance that doesn't need to be there. I tend to use a little bit of beeswax between the sole and the seam allowance. It sort of helps keep it stuck down. And hammer that edge down nicely so it's not bumpy. And then we can actually get to the turning process. On the first shoe when I did this, I definitely forgot the fact that I could actually put these shoes back into the water to rehydrate that sole and make it easier to turn. I'm used to working with ladies' 18th century shoes, which are very often fabric or silk uppers, and I can't throw that into a bucket of water. So thankfully for this second shoe, I had actually gone and watched Morgan Donner's video of how she made her medieval shoes, which are a different style and a slightly different construction technique. And she noted that in her video, and I realized how silly I had been and why it had been so difficult to get that shoe turned the first time, especially with that pointed toe. So I made sure to do that on the second round, and it was a much faster and easier process. After turning the shoe, I will relast it. I decided not to use the last that I had already been using just because sometimes it's very difficult to get those fit back in there, especially with that long pointed toe. So I decided to be a little bit lazy and use another last of the same style, so that way I could do the finishing on the sole, such as closing up the tack holes and making sure that the edges are nicely laid down flat. The last few steps that I waited to the end on were the reinforcements and adding the straps to the uppers. This really should have been done before I made the shoe altogether, but I didn't want the strap to get into the way of my shoemaking process, and I also was not 100% sure that this was going to fit me correctly, so I wanted to save that last little bit of adjustment for later. The reinforcement stitches that I'm doing around the edges are making sure that that area doesn't stretch out, and it also runs across the seam, so that way it helps prevent that seam from splitting later.